Hello, everybody. This is my distinct honor and pleasure to speak at Global Food Allergy Summit. Today, I will be talking about what is sustained tolerance. And so I'm very much a mechanism-driven guy, so I will tend to be more focused on concepts and mechanisms rather than details. And I hope you find this presentation informative. So, as you know, when we're trying to desensitize people to whatever foods they are allergic to, we have certain treatment goals. Our most important goal is to reduce the risk of a life-threatening reaction and allow for a greater level of safety in the process. Our secondary goal is to allow the person to reintroduce the food in their diet so that they don't have to restrict their diet so much. And then the third goal, which is what we will be talking about today, is how do you reach the state of sustained tolerance? And sustained tolerance is a state where you don't have to take your allergenic food every day, and you don't have to worry so much about all the restrictions that oral immunotherapy poses, at least early on in the process, such as exercise avoidance or worrying about reducing the dose when the person is sick. So as you may already know, food allergy desensitization can be performed using many different protocols. The protocol that we're going to be focusing on today is oral immunotherapy, or OIT. There are other desensitization protocols that we also use. One is called sublingual immunotherapy, which is an easier protocol. However, it is not as effective as oral immunotherapy is, and in many cases it's not sufficient to get the person desensitized and achieve the desired goal. There's also another protocol that's been studied. It's called epicutaneous immunotherapy, or patch immunotherapy, and that's another way that desensitization can be achieved, although that probably is not as effective as oral immunotherapy either. However, slit as well as patch desensitizations are safer in terms of having reduced risk of anaphylactic reaction while one is undergoing the treatment. However, they may not lead to the same magnitude of desensitization that oral immunotherapy can achieve. Now, this is an image that I just plagiarized shamelessly from the internet. So I apologize to the author of this slide. And I just wanted to bring out a few main points as to the major players in an allergic reaction. In the top left corner is the antigen or the allergen, and in our case it is the food that the person is allergic to. It may be peanut protein, it may be cow's milk protein or egg protein, or whatever the person is allergic to. And the cells that make the antibodies called IgE, which is responsible for allergic reactions, are these so-called B cells. And then the IgE molecules bind to the surface of the mast cells, which are the cells which make all the mediators that cause allergic reactions, most important being histamine that everybody knows about. But then there are other mediators also, which are released by mast cells, and they're the ones responsible for an allergic reaction and anaphylaxis. There are other cells involved too, the most important of which is the so-called T cells, and there are multiple types of T cells. The ones we focus on mostly are the so-called the helper T cells, and the helper T cells help in the process of stimulating the immune system to cause the allergic reactions. Then there are also the so-called regulatory T cells, and regulatory T cells are the ones which are sort of dampening down the allergic reactions. And then the third type of T cells and other types of cells also can be in that same category, which are called the memory cells. And ultimately, it's the memory cells which stay behind and are responsible for ongoing allergy to a food or any other allergen for that matter. So again, here I'm again summarizing some of the key players in an allergic reactions. Mast cells, these are the cells which make all the mediators which cause allergic reactions. IgE molecules are the specific antibodies which are responsible for the allergic reactions, and they're the ones which are bound to the surface of the mast cells and induce that allergic reactions. Now, another player we're going to introduce here is this IgG4 antibodies. And the way I look at it, when it comes to an allergic reaction, IgE is those are the bad guys. Those are the ones responsible for an allergic reactions. And IgG4 is sort of the good guy. They are the ones who actually compete against IgE and ultimately reduce the risk of an allergic reaction by doing so. Now, helper T cells, helper may imply that they're good guys, but actually these are also the ones responsible for inducing and stimulating an allergic reactions. And regulatory T cells are the good guys who actually dampen an allergic reactions and lead to tolerance. Memory cells are the cells which are responsible for ongoing allergy to any allergen. So one reason why, let's say, peanut allergy may stay throughout the one's lifetime is because these memory cells hang around and they're there for long periods of time, and that's why people don't lose their allergy. It's because of the memory cells which are present. So when it comes to the various different mechanisms of desensitization, the first mechanism that comes into play when somebody is getting desensitized, so like in the first days and the first day when a person comes in for the oral desensitization and they start off with an extremely small dose, and one goes through multiple dose escalations on the first day, the mechanism that is operating on that day to induce tolerance is this mechanism called mast cell energy with an A instead of an E. Certainly has totally different meaning here. And so what that means is the mast cells get exposed to the allergen, but they just don't respond. They don't release all the mediators which cause the allergic reaction. And this process happens only when you start off with an extremely low dose and gradually go up to a higher dose. And this mechanism we've used for the last 50 years for things like penicillin desensitization. So when somebody is allergic to penicillin, and if we want to desensitize that person to penicillin, what we would do is again start off with a very small dose of penicillin and go up gradually, and that process can be completed in a few hours. And the primary mechanism that's operating in desensitizing people to penicillin is this so-called mast cell energy. And then after a few weeks, a few months, the other mechanism that takes over in terms of doing the heavy duty work or heavy lifting of desensitization is the so-called regulatory T cell activation. And so these are the good guys we talked about. And so these are the ones which sort of dampen the effects of the helper T cells and allow desensitization or tolerization to happen. So in the first 6 months of an OIT protocol, typically it's the mast cell energy and the regulatory T cell pathways which are dominant in inducing tolerance or achieving desensitization. And the important thing about these pathways are these are very dynamic, meaning every moment of every day, the immune system is trying to decide, is it going to allow the allergic pathway to get activated and cause allergic reactions, or is it going to allow these regulatory pathways to dominate and suppress the allergic reaction? And because it is such a dynamic process, it's very much dependent on what the overall state of that individual is on a particular day. So if somebody is stressed out, if somebody has a big sport event and are exercising for 2 hours, or if somebody has an exam and are all stressed out because of that, all those things, or somebody gets an infection, all those things sort of break down the regulatory pathways, break down this energy, so-called energy, and ultimately allow for the allergic reaction to move forward. And then that's one of the big challenges in desensitization, that sometimes these regulatory pathways sort of break down. Now, after 6 months or so, another mechanism starts being activated, and that is the generation of these good guys, the IgG4 molecules, and they're the ones which then start competing with IgE and ultimately lead to a more sustained tolerance. And so that's a very important step in inducing what we would call sustained tolerance. And then the final step, in some ways the most important step, is programmed cell death, where the memory cells, and these are the cells which are responsible for ongoing allergy to a food. Those memory cells can ultimately die off, and that process takes years to achieve. But once those memory cells die off, then it is indeed a very stable situation. It's a very sustained condition, and that's the fundamental mechanism of sustained tolerance. It's the activation of IgG4 molecules, and it's the programmed cell death of these memory cells. And so this is another figure that I stole from the internet. And this is more for conventional allergy shots, but the same principles apply over here as well. And so what it shows is that when you start the desensitization process, in the first 6 months or so, the IgE values can go up. And so we see parents come in to our office all concerned that, our child must not be getting desensitized because this IgE number keeps going up, and that can't be good. And that's part of the reason we don't even bother looking at IgE in the first year into the desensitization process, because it's meaningless. The important thing is the first two desensitization mechanisms that we talked about are the ones which are dominant mechanisms early on in this desensitization process. And so we don't expect the IgE molecule to come down. But as time goes on into the second and third year onwards, what we see is that the IgE numbers gradually start going down. And that happens for two reasons. First of all, the regulatory T cells induce what we would call downregulation of these IgE molecules. And to some extent, you have die-off of the memory cells, and that's another mechanism by which IgE molecules start coming down. And with that, we also see a rise in the IgG4 levels. And that's another very important mechanism in what we would call sustained tolerance. And so here I'm summarizing some of the milestones in desensitization. So again, the first step is transient desensitization. That's when you primarily have this mast cell anergy as the primary mechanism by which desensitization is happening. You need daily exposure to the allergen. If you miss the dose even for a single day, the desensitization process is lost. But as the other mechanisms start taking over, the process becomes more and more sustained in some ways. So as we're moving forward and going up on the dose of the allergen that we're getting the person desensitized to, after a certain point, there come other milestones. One is the so-called cross-contamination protection, where we've gone up high enough in the amount of allergen that the person is taking that in most realistic scenarios, it's unlikely they're going to get that much exposure through cross-contamination. And then typically by the time individuals graduate from our OIT program, we say the person has close to bite-proof protection, meaning even if they were to eat some food which contained the allergen as one of the ingredient of that food, even that, a single bite of that is unlikely to lead to an anaphylactic reaction. And so that's the stage people get up to when they graduate from a typical OIT program. And then when they're in their maintenance phase, where they're taking their maintenance dose every day at home, over time, typically in a year or two, one would reach those other milestones pretty much at home, the free eating status, where they can pretty much eat as much of that food as they want to without a reaction. And then the final stage, the so-called sustained tolerance, when they don't have to take that food every single day anymore. So some of the criteria we use for the sustained tolerance, we talked about the fact that we want to have the regulatory pathways activated sufficiently that they cause the IgE levels to go down. And we also want those memory T cells to die off, so that when the IgE levels go down by 80% or more, that's one of our criteria that the person has achieved sustained tolerance. The other thing we want to see is that this IgG4 level has to go up. And IgG4 levels are now it's a commercially available test from many companies for at least a few foods, such as peanut and egg and milk and things like that. But still, it's not as widely available, and it also often is not covered by insurance. And that's part of the reason IgG4 does not get checked as often as it should be. And then some other criteria we use to ensure that the person has achieved sustained tolerance is that there are no unexplained allergic reactions happening, because when unexplained allergic reactions are happening, that's when we know that the first two mechanisms, this mast cell anergy and activation of the regulatory T cells, those are more dominant mechanisms for desensitization. And whenever that is there, you don't have sustained tolerance. You have to have the last two mechanisms become the dominant pathways of tolerization. And then typically, by the time sustained tolerance is achieved, the person can tolerate a lot more of that food than what their maintenance dose is. So for example, for peanut, if the maintenance dose is 1 gram of protein, one ought to be able to tolerate at least 4 grams of peanut protein by the time sustained tolerance is achieved. And when all those criteria are met, then we gradually reduce the frequency of the maintenance dose from daily to twice per week. And so that process typically happens relatively gradually, because there's no urgency in going down to twice per week from once a day. And so that's pretty much my talk. I hope I've answered many of your burning questions about what is sustained tolerance. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, I work at Columbia Allergy. We have 12 locations in California, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And we can be reached with this contact information. Thank you very much for your interest in this talk. Thank you.